applies, please. Oh yeah, recording is now happening. Thank you. Only unmute yourself when you're asking a question. The way we want to organize it is that Roberto will start with a presentation. And if you have a quick question about something that he says, something you don't understand or so, then please raise your hand and you can ask a question immediately. But larger questions or questions about concrete cases or so are meant to be for the Q&A in the second half of the webinar. And as you probably know, it's always a bit strange when one speaks to a set of black Zoom windows. So maybe to welcome Roberto and to thank him for doing this, we can have a short start where everyone who can do this and feels comfortable can switch on their camera and just say hi to Roberto. And then I'll hand over to him and we can just say hi to him and thank him again for doing this. Over to you, Roberto.
Hi, everyone. Did you hear me now? Okay. All right. I'll start straight with, okay, just building up on what Lisa said. Let me state very clearly that what I'm going to present is not the journal's view, it's not the other editor's view, it's certainly not the association's view, and to some extent it's not even my own view. What do I mean by this is that rather than, so we thought about this, and one possibility would be to just present the journal and tell you what we do. But then we thought, Rose, the Review of Social Economy is probably not the only outlet that will cross your path, and it would be more useful to present a sort of a broader view of the publishing process. And this implies that some of the things that I will say do not necessarily apply to Rose, but are more like hurdles that you might find along the way, and things you have to be aware of that may be more relevant in certain fields and disciplines, less relevant in other fields and disciplines. Now, it's extremely difficult to provide guidance that is valid for all, but what I've done is I've searched around. So I will base this presentation partly on my experience. I'm one of the 4 editors of the Review of Social Economy, one of the 4 editors of the Journal of Economic Surveys, one of the several editors of Metro Economica, and I have refereed, I don't even remember, something around 150 papers. I have submitted also plenty of papers. So I will use my own experience as well. But in addition to that, I have looked at editors who've finished their editorial stint and then have published their reflections on the editorial process as a basis for this, just to give you a broad view of what the profession, and indeed not just the profession, but the mainstream side of the profession, as well as the heterodox side of the profession, and even outside economics. So I will build on material that comes from a former American Economic Review editor, a document produced by the editors of the leading heterodox journals, as well as from an editor from outside of economics. Again, the idea is I've tried to put down notes that, just like Elisa mentioned, I would have loved somebody to tell me. Perhaps this is different from what is useful to you, but I hope the Q&A session will help you help us actually, both you and me, to maybe cover some issues that I will not be able to cover in the presentation. They're just forgotten, or maybe I thought they were obvious and you think actually are the key things to be discussed. In fact, bear with me, some of the things that you'll see will seem exceptionally obvious to you. Well, based on my experience as an editor, nothing is too obvious. And this is, in a sense, the underlying theme of this presentation. You'll be surprised by the kind of mistakes that authors make that seriously compromise, at least in some places, their chances to be published. So I'm going to share my screen now and jump straight to this. Can you see the screen? Yep. So meet the editors, that would be us, and a few tips on how to publish in any journals. the presentation will be structured around, in a sense, the process of writing a paper and eventually getting a response from a journal. So it's going to be a step-by-step guide into the writing and publishing process. Write your paper. Now, this may seem, again, trivial to you, but this is, in very many respects, the most fundamental step. And there are a lot of mistakes that people can make here. When I submitted my very first paper, it was to a journal called Economics and Philosophy, and it was an amazing experience in very many respects. The most amazing thing was that the referee sent a referee report which was longer than the paper. It's never happened to me, and it was a philosopher, not an economist. Actually, there were two reports. One was an economist report, and it was 1 paragraph long, and it ended with a sentence, and after the second paragraph of the paper, I couldn't understand the rest, and suggested the rejection. The philosopher wrote a paper, essentially. So the report was longer than a paper. And the very first sentence of the referee report said, the author is probably a PhD student, and that was true at the time, and should keep in mind that there is a structure that a paper must have in order for the paper to be properly written. In the introduction, you say what you're going to say. Then you use the main text to say it, and then you conclude by saying that you've actually said it. Again, you'd be surprised by how many papers don't do that. So, in the words of Preston McAfee, former American Economic Review editor, a surprising number of papers provide no meaningful conclusion. I consider these papers to be fatally incomplete. I have seen one that had a heading conclusion with only 1 sentence, see the introduction. Now, why is this important? Because the introduction and the conclusions are often the very first things that referees, as well as editors, look at. And very often they make up their minds just based on that. They may, or sometimes may not, as it happened in my case, continue reading the paper. But the key thing is, even if they do continue, sometimes the introduction is enough for them to make up their mind. And then the rest of the reading the paper is just to find reasons, say, to kill the paper if the introduction is not properly written. Similarly, the conclusion is fundamentally important because that's one of the things that people actually remember. Since it is the last thing that you read, that's the kind of thing that sticks in the referee's mind. So what kind of paper should you write? So once you get the structure right, say what you're going to say it in the introduction, say it, and then in the conclusion, say that you've said it. I would say that in general, shorter is ceteris paribus better. Some journals are switching to a model where there are no longer page budgets. So length is not a massive issue. However, for the vast majority of journals, length is an issue in the sense that they have page budgets, and you have to keep in mind that there is a massive competition for space. So the Review of Social Economy gets, for example, and we are not the American Economic Review, but we get between 250 and sometimes up to 300 papers a year. We can only publish a very small amount of papers, say around 10% of these. Therefore, there are a lot of papers which are marginal cases. And that's the kind of papers where a longer or a shorter format may make a difference at the margin. So think of writing like sculpting. So take a big chunk of material out there and then start sculpting away. Another trick, which is not very often used, but is exceptionally relevant, is to put all the secondary material, which is still relevant to the paper, but still put it in the appendix. The main reason, so it depends, so what is secondary but still relevant, it depends on the kind of papers you write. So if you write a heavy mathematical paper, then you may have a main theorem in the body of the paper and then smaller results in the appendix or auxiliary results. If you write an empirical paper, you may put the description of the data in the appendix. And again, think about your field, and I'm pretty sure that you can start, once you get into the mood of thinking about these things, you can spot what falls into this category. But this is very important because One thing that this allows the editor to do is that if this material is indeed secondary, this always offers a way of saying, okay, and then shorten the paper by, say, eliminating the appendix. It gives a very clear and visual suggestion to the editor that a paper can be made shorter if needed. And of course, it doesn't need to go that way, but you're given this freedom to the editor. Increasingly, a large number of journals, and this includes the Review of Social Economy, allow authors to put some secondary and only marginally relevant material in an addendum to be published only online. So if you do empirical stuff, you could do a series of robustness checks, or you have special cases of your grand theory, whatever it is, a major philosophical breakthrough, but then you apply it to some special cases that may be sort of less relevant. Or if you do social choice, then you can put the proof of independence of axioms, all this suggesting very clearly it's an addendum to be published online and to be made available to referees if they want it for the refereeing process. And note that, for example, so if you do computational work, the code of your computation is a typical candidate for something to be published online. Again, this is for the purpose of shortening a paper. Why is this important? I cannot emphasize how important it is to write shorter papers. I mean, I've seen papers up to 60 pages long, and that is almost inevitably a major hurdle that you're placing in front of yourself. As again, McAfee says, not many editors and many referees will think, how much work do I have to do and time do I have to spend for the amount of insight I receive? Now, this is very important because longer papers will automatically imply that the referees and the editors will raise the bar and will say, okay, shall I devote this much space of my journal, of a journal, to this paper? So if you do go the long way, it is very important to be clear about the contribution and relating it accurately to other papers, which makes the paper simpler to understand and more likely to be accepted. Which leads me to the very next point. I cannot emphasize enough how fundamentally important it is to be extraordinarily clear without, looking self-aggrandizing, but about what is different, new, and original about your paper. This should be clear from the get-go, straight from the abstract, and after at most the first 3 pages of the paper. If by page 10, an average economist or an average philosopher or sociologist cannot understand where you're headed, most likely they're going to recommend a rejection. So again, McAfee, the amount of time necessary to establish beyond the reasonable doubt that a paper is not suitable for a journal ranges from a few minutes when the paper's own summary of its findings are incomprehensible or not ambitious to many hours. Now, why is this so important? Because I have seen countless authors thinking that their paper was rejected on, say, ideological grounds, or because they were on the wrong side of a methodological dispute, or because they had a theory paper and the journal preferred empirical work. I mean, you can think all sorts of things. Now, this is certainly the case. There's plenty of biases in the profession, millions of biases. But the whole point is you have to try and protect yourself as much as possible and not give ammunition to bias. Some biases need to be fought at a higher level by, say, a political campaign to make sure that certain, say, minorities are not disadvantaged and things like that. But at the same time, when you submit to paper, you have to think, how do I shield myself as much as possible from all sorts of conscious and unconscious bias? And the one most important thing is to be extraordinarily clear about what the paper does, why it is interesting, and why it is original. Remember the abstract. Now, this comes from one of the contributions I mentioned earlier on. It's a bunch of editors from heterodox journals. So far I've shown you what a former editor of the American Economic Review says, but what you read in this very interesting document that you can find at the link below is not very different. So they say the abstract is representative of your work. And if the former is shabby, it speaks badly about the latter. In the abstract, emphasize in particular the importance of the problem under consideration and the novelty and innovativeness of your paper. So this is one of the things where the orthodox-heterodox divide is not really relevant. What matters is whatever your field, whatever your approach, whatever your discipline, you have to make sure that what you're trying to say is clear, and it is clear to everybody that it is important and interesting and new. Which means write carefully. So part of it is a more general issue of structure. That's what I started with. Structure your paper very clearly. Another aspect of it is be clear about your contribution. And then don't forget to cross the T's and dot the I's. Again, this is a bunch of heterodox, editors of heterodox economics journals. Poorly written papers will almost always receive a bad review from the referees, and in some cases would be even desk rejected. It is not the responsibility of the editors or the proofreaders of the journal to correct bad writing. So I've seen a lot of examples, and let me note that the Review of Social Economy is very different in this respect. We have, for example, introduced a policy whereby if we receive a paper which is very interesting on substantive grounds, but it's not polished from the viewpoint of language, and it comes from a scholar who's not an English native speaker, we are actually willing to pay for proofreading and copy editing once the paper is accepted. But mind you, what the editors are telling you here is that many of the biases are already in the referees' minds. And if you write a poorly written paper, then it will be the referees who are going to recommend a rejection. So I've seen, for example, a lot, I mean, I can mention millions of examples where authors have literally shot themselves in the foot. For example, papers written originally in a different language and partly translated into English. So tables are still in whatever original language it was written in. I've seen several of these. Or papers with entire sentences still in the original language. And these things, especially if they escape the editor's attention at the beginning, so the editors cannot, as we do often, go back to the author and say, look, you've forgotten to do a couple of things, you don't want to do this. Then they reach the referees and the chances of publication are seriously harmed. So write the paper, then check it, and once you think you've done it, you leave it aside and you check it again the following day. Because this may come as a shock to you, but some editors receive papers with unfinished sentences and quotes, and even with personal notes that the author inserted, intending to get to them later. You'll just be surprised. I've seen a paper, for example, that was submitted. Clearly, the author had not checked it properly because it just contained the title. And this is not just economists, mind you. So this is not a bias that affects only us economists, and I'm talking about myself in particular, who are obsessed about precision and tight formal stuff, etc. Look at what the editor of the Journal of Advanced Composition, an interdisciplinary journal, by the way, of rhetoric, writing, culture, and politics, says. She says, a meticulously polished manuscript leaves us, editors and referees, confident in you and your work. And conversely, if a shabby manuscript gives precisely the opposite impression. Why is this very important? Another thing to keep in mind is that it's not just journal space that is scarce. So we can publish around, let's say, 30 articles a year out of the around 300 we receive. Well, another very scarce resource is referees' time and goodwill. Finding good referees is extraordinarily difficult. And if you send an incredibly bad paper to a referee, most likely this person is not going to referee for you again. So there is a huge incentive for editors not to send out manuscripts that are poorly written, because it is very difficult to find referees. A lot of people take a look at the manuscript and say, I don't want to read this stuff. And at the same time, even if they do get them once, they may not get them again because of a harmed reputation. And write well if you can. I mean, all I've said so far is really the basic, is literally just not messing up with your paper. But if you can, it'd be good if you could write well in an engaging way. And writing well could mean a lot of things. So when I was a PhD student, one thing that we were shown is this piece by William Thompson, The Young Person's Guide to Writing Economic Theory. It's hugely biased towards formal stuff, so I don't think it will apply to many of you. But if you can find anything analogous in whatever field it is you work in, that's certainly something worth looking at. Why? Because these things, if anything, they express what the average economist, or if more precisely the average editor, Thompson was a former editor of Econometrica, will think. And you want to understand what these guys think in order to avoid making mistakes that will harm you when submitting. More precisely, whatever your field is, it would be good to choose the right language. There is a jargon in whatever field. There is a certain type of writing, formal stuff, and you have to use that kind of jargon, but there will be jargons in every single field that you can think of. So it is very, very important to read papers in your field, whatever that field is, no matter how broad or small, and make sure that you show that you engage with this literature, even at the level of using the right language. More generally, you should show awareness of the relevant literature, both the classic literature, so the classics, whatever they are, and recent. I've seen a lot of papers where the author cited, let's say, Kant, Rousseau, and themselves. Or conversely, I've seen plenty of papers that cited only the last working papers published in the last 2 years. I think that if you want to show command of whatever literature is relevant for your work, you should normally show awareness of the classic work as well as the recent one. You must not give the impression of being unaware of the relevant literature and perhaps even of missing out some of its most important pieces. Again, this comes from a bunch of editors of heterodox journals. So this is not just, mainstream guys obsessing over the last NBR working paper. This is about, a Marxist editor saying, oh, this is a nice piece on class struggle, except the author is not quoting Marx or something like that. And showing awareness of the literature means also being very, very, very careful when it comes to referencing other people. So you'd be surprised by the sheer amount of plagiarism that goes on in the profession at large, not just economics, but pretty much everywhere. There are several typical offenses, and we at the Review of Social Economy have seen several. So blatant copy and paste, people who just translate so they think, well, this is an unknown journal, say from Italy, and a paper written in Italian, so I'll just steal this work from this other author and translate it into English. But also sometimes even in English, people take papers from a different field and try to publish them in interdisciplinary journals or even journals from a different fields. This is obviously a major offense, and it would be important to note that an increasing number of journals, including the Review of Social Economy, are using similarity softwares. Now, if you work in academia, you will have seen several of these. They are pretty much the same as you would use to check plagiarism with your students' work, slightly more sophisticated, but it's basically the same principle. And at the Review of Social Economy, I think we have rejected about, in 4 years, about 24 papers that were blatant cases of plagiarism. Now, what happens in this case varies from journal to journal. So the Review of Social Economy takes the view that, generally speaking, it could just be a mistake. It could be that people, I mean, we don't point fingers, the paper just gets rejected, and we just forward the similarity report to the authors, who can then fix this in their next submission. But you should be mindful that a lot of journals take much more stringent and severe policies in these cases, and they might even contact line managers of the offenders. There are, of course, a lot of borderline cases, and we can discuss them in the Q&A if you want, but the general point is you should be very careful in referencing others and clarify your contribution, because it can happen, and it has happened, including at Rose, that although there was no clear case of plagiarism, there was a case of some referee saying, well, this is basically very close to something I've done, but I've done it before, or my paper is now being considered somewhere else, and this guy is stealing my idea. Now, this is not necessarily plagiarism, it's a borderline case, but it obviously creates a nervous reaction from the editors, which may significantly harm your chances of being published. So you should be very careful in saying, in placing your paper in the literature, on the one hand, because it gives a strong sign that you're aware of what goes on, and on the other hand, because it clearly shows what your personal addition, what's original about your paper, what your addition is, and what's original about your paper. A similar issue arises with self-plagiarism, and the sentences that follow come from the former editor of another heterodox or heterodox-friendly journal, Barclay Rossa, the editor of Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization at the time, now editor of the Review of Economic Behavior and Organization, who says many economists unfortunately engage in submitting papers that are nearly identical to each other to several journals. While not plagiarism, there is clearly a problem of the submitted paper lacking anything sufficiently new to warrant publication. For me, a red flag is a failure to cite the other papers. Authors need to clearly explain exactly where a particular paper fits into their research program, and even though some frown on self-citation, some of it is in fact needed to help clarify precisely this point. Again, you would be surprised by the amount of unclear referencing that eventually harms authors, even if there is no clear case of self-plagiarism. We can discuss this at length. I think these problems arise largely from the publish or perish atmosphere that now rules academia, but the truth of the matter is most of us have sort of one big idea that is then split into several papers, which, by the way, is one of the strategies that fits precisely my description of writing shorter papers. Some people would argue that the golden rule is one paper, one idea. Now, of course, if then you have several connected ideas, it becomes difficult to differentiate one paper from the other. That's why, again, the introduction and the discussion of the related literature is so important, because you can then explain what the point that you're making in a specific paper, how it is different from points made in companion papers. So all this was about writing your paper. And again, this may seem incredibly trivial to you, but you'd be surprised. The next step is not to submit your paper. I would strongly urge people who are, say, in the middle of their PhD or fresh out of a PhD, but even older scholars, if they don't do it, I would strongly discourage you from submitting your paper as soon as you're finished writing it. The second step, in my view, should be to get your paper out, as in presenting your paper first in your department and to your peers and friends. Then go to conferences and seminars. And why not send your paper to the experts in your field. Worst case scenario, you do not get any feedback, but eventually you might get very good feedback. And this is fundamentally important. So why is this all very important? So point number one is, let me check. Okay, yeah. So point number one is you want to get feedback. This is true in general. It is especially true from the experts in the field, because these people might easily be the referees of your paper. And it's always good to know in advance what people in your field think are the strengths and weaknesses of your paper. And the third reason is, by simply presenting your paper, I think that the shape of your argument gets clear in your own mind. So when I was a PhD student, I wrote my very first paper, and it became a working paper. At the time, working papers were actually physically working papers. I printed 150 of those, and I actually sent them to 150 people working in the field. Only 15 of these replied, but I got the most useful feedback ever. And one of the persons I sent it to eventually turned out, I realized this many years later, as one of the referees of the paper, which eventually was accepted. Why am I saying this? Because editors hate to receive clearly unfinished papers, or first drafts even. You should not use submissions primarily as a means for getting basic feedback on your work. Of course, not all authors agree, but in my view, we are in the business of evaluating papers, not improving papers. If you want to improve your paper, ask your colleagues for advice. When you know what you want to say and how to say it, submit it to a journal. Again, Rose is slightly different. We are certainly more tolerant and more welcoming of younger scholars, but keep in mind that not all journals are like Rose. I can tell you for sure that many referees would easily spot or think they will spot an unfinished paper and kill it straight away. Once you have written the paper, once you have circulated it, gotten feedback, improved it, started to understand exactly how to package the paper for your relevant audience, then you can submit it. And the first thing is to actually aim well. Choose the relevant outlet. So how do you do that? Well, get the information. Part of the getting the information is actually also going to conferences and mingle and talk to people, etc. Because very often at conferences, you will get information through the grapevine. It's not always very useful information. All people hold grudges against editors. They all have horror stories, but you start to get a feel about what happens at the journal once you start collecting information. But if you don't do that, at the very least, you should very carefully browse the journal and look, for example, at journal statistics. And these days, you can look, for example, at Rose. We have a tab on our webpage where we provide information about turnaround time, rejection rate, etc. So, for example, if you're pressed for time, maybe because you have tenure in your field, in your university, you're up for tenure, then you certainly shouldn't send a paper to a journal that has a very, very high turnaround time. Another thing that you can do is to look at the editorial board and check whether it contains people in your field. This is true, especially if it is a general journal or an outlet not exactly in your field. If you're submitting something in your field, that should be pretty evident. So you're a development economist and you submit to the Journal of Development Studies or the Review of Development Economics, that's pretty obvious that there will be people who are sympathetic to your approach, topic, and methodology, and who are experts in the field so they can evaluate your paper. But if not, then make sure that there is somebody on the board who would be a natural candidate as, say, editor or associate editor in charge of your work. Of course, there are caveats. Why? Because submitting a paper where the editor has deep expertise usually produces a higher bar, but less variance in the evaluation. So if the editor knows very, very well a certain field, then the editor may be less uncertain about quality, and then ask for, or consciously or unconsciously ask for a more relevant contribution. Now, one thing to keep in mind is this: not all information is easily available. So at the Review of Social Economy, for example, we have recently decided to include in the editors and associate editors' web pages straight on our journal's web page. So if you want to have an idea about who we are and what the field of expertise or the areas of expertise are, you just need to go there and click on the relevant names. But this is not true for many, many journals. If you're in doubt, my suggestion would be to just contact the editors. I know of no editors who is hassled or hates authors who say, look, this is my paper, sorry, not this is my paper. You don't send the paper, you send an abstract maybe, or a brief description and say, look, this is what I'm writing about. Would it fall within the remit of the journal, or is it completely outside and hopeless? And then the editor is always free to say, okay, fine, do it. Or, nah, that's not what we deal with. It would be a waste of everybody's time. If you do that, it saves your time and it saves the editor's time. And it is very, very wise to do it if you're unsure. Another thing that is worth looking at, and there's many ways where you can do this, say newsletters, for example, the Heterodox Economics newsletter is particularly good in this respect, but also journals, web pages, they publish information about special issues, and it may well be the case that a special issue is coming up precisely on what you're working on. Once you've collected all the information, then it is time to choose. And here, my strong suggestion is, wherever you come from, no matter how small in your perception your university is, you don't come from Harvard, let's say, and you think, oh, okay, I'm never going to make it to, say, philosophy and public affairs or ethics or the American Sociological Review or whatever is the journal that is in the top journal in your field, say the Cambridge Journal of Economics if you are a heterodox economist. The one thing that you have to keep in mind is the only battle that is always lost for sure is the one that you don't fight. So if you're not in a hurry to publish, why not send the paper to the top journal in your field, whatever that is? It is very often the case that you do get very useful feedback. So even in journals that you might think, oh, they're never going to consider my work, you may still get very useful information, if not in the form of detailed comments on what you've written, at least indirectly in the sense of how is my paper perceived at a quick look. And a quick look is what many, many editors will give at first to your paper. And therefore you want to understand what they're going to think when they flick through your paper. Never submit randomly. Just don't do it. It's a waste of everybody's time. In fact, you're lucky if the paper is not desk rejected. If the paper is desk rejected once you've submitted it randomly to, say, a journal, because it may well happen that it is still the wrong outlet, so it's going to be eventually rejected, but it sits in the journal for a very long time. So most of my experience, says former editor of AER, is editing general interest journals. And as a result, my #1 reason for the rejection is that the paper is too specialized for the audience. But this is not, in general, the only reason for rejecting a paper. So different journals have, whatever field they specialize in, and anything that falls outside will inevitably be frowned upon. So for example, if you send an original paper to the Journal of Economic Surveys, it's going to be rejected, not for ideological reasons, but because it's not a survey. If it is a journal in, say, that specializes on social economy, like we do, if you send us a paper on the Taylor rule and the effect of inflation on the macroeconomy, that's going to be rejected. Not because we don't like the paper, not because the paper is not good, but it's because it has nothing to do with the social economy. And similarly, At Rose, we emphasize interdisciplinarity. So anything which is too specialized, either in any of the disciplines, philosophy, economics, and sociology or political science, is likely to be rejected. So a good strategy is to identify the audience of your paper and then submit to a journal that reaches that audience. And then cite relevant papers. This is not always true, but for many editors it is. Cite relevant papers appeared in the relevant journal. My own pet peeve is writers, not my own, but the person who's writing. My own pet peeve is writers who submit manuscripts that fail to cite articles previously published in the journal on the topic. If you think of scholarly work as a kind of ongoing conversation about a series of key topics in the discipline, then it is important to acknowledge those who are already participating in the conversation. When you attempt to join a conversation by submitting a manuscript to a journal, but you fail to cite previously published work relevant to your own scholarship, you not only slight the journal and the other scholars, but you also might be sending a message that perhaps you haven't kept up with latest scholarship. Not a good signal to send your editor. And again, this is not an economist. It is important to note that this is different from my earlier point about clearly placing your paper within the relevant literature. This is about the specific journal you're sending your paper to. And to be fair, there's a lot of journals who are doing this in a very cynical way. The equivalent of publish and, or perish strategy for journals is the be cited or perish. And a lot of journal editors, that's not our case, actually insist that authors of submissions cite previously published papers, even if they're not strictly relevant. And the reason is to increase citations. I think this is pretty distasteful, but it is something that is worth keeping in mind when you submit. And here you go. And multiple offense number two, major offense number two, which relates not to how you write your paper, but to the submission stage, and that is multiple submissions. This may seem redundant to you, but I have seen multiple submissions, and these are very serious. I mean, multiple submissions almost inevitably in all journals lead to major action, including contacting, say, the head of school, the provost, the dean, and whatnot. For most journals, multiple submissions is a major contractual breach and breach of academic ethics. So this is not to be done at all costs. Now, again, about the submission process. This is not about writing. My suggestion is read, think, and then read again. What am I referring to here? Read the instructions for authors. For example, the rules for anonymizing the paper and any caps on length. First of all, it saves time. For example, if the paper is not properly anonymized, at the Review of Social Economy, there is an administrative person, a journal editorial assistant, who checks the paper and unsubmits it, sends it back to the author. This takes time, and you may easily waste 2 weeks just because you didn't anonymize the paper. But second, for many editors, disregarding a journal submission requirement is yet another way to communicate either sloppiness or lack of concern. So, for example, in the case of the Review of Social Economy, we have no pre-specified format. We have a policy that says your paper, your format. And I think we're pretty proud of this because it makes people's life easy. Because following the rule I just mentioned to you is very time consuming because different journals will have different styles, you know, endnotes versus footnotes, for example. However, you should be aware that if a journal specifies that only endnotes are allowed and you use footnotes, an editor may easily desk reject your paper just because of this, and maybe encourage a submission or maybe not. For online submissions, which is basically universally adopted now, you would want to carefully check both the PDF and HTML version of the paper, keeping in mind that it is your responsibility to make sure that everything is okay. You may think that you included everything, but it may easily be the case that the PDF did not compile properly and the submission is botched, lines are missing, figures are missing, and stuff like that. I can promise you it happens all the time. Another thing that is worth keeping in mind is cover letters. There is no need to write cover letters stating that you're submitting a paper. We can see that. So use a cover letter only to write anything that is actually meaningful. For example, please keep in mind that there is an addendum that is not part of the main submission, for example. Please note that I'm going to provide the relevant data if the paper is accepted, but not before, or please note that the data are proprietary or for whatever reason. Another thing that so cover letters can be used. They can be used to convey relevant information, but they should not be used to send a completely meaningless message. I've seen millions of letters saying, here's my paper, and that doesn't look good. The other thing is some journals, oh, by the way, some journals have dispensed with cover letters altogether. Now, some journals allow you to suggest referees. A lot of people are nervous, especially if you're younger, you think, well, this is going to look dodgy. Well, if they allow you to suggest referees, you may just as well do it. There is nothing wrong with it. Finding referees is the most time-consuming part of the editorial process. You want good referees, and they're always very difficult to find, especially for journals that have a reasonably broad audience and therefore receive papers from all sorts of fields. Suggesting, now of course, if you suggest one referee, one name only, that's not very clever. I would suggest mentioning a few people, typically reasonable people, or people who are established in your profession and are not obviously linked to you. So not your maternal grandfather, and certainly not people from your own department or your co-authors. In fact, when you suggest somebody, make sure that you do it when you're given this opportunity by the editorial process. So there is a field in your online submission which says you can suggest referees now. If that is not allowed, I would suggest not to do it. And even if you do it, never give the impression that you're requesting the paper that be sent to someone, because that gives a very, very bad impression. Once you've submitted, be patient, but not too patient. So do not contact the editors after 3 weeks. Keep in mind that, for example, at Rose, it takes a week normally for the paper to go through just the production checks. And remember, your paper is usually not the only one under review. So if you write to the editor 3 weeks after you've submitted, you're just sending a very bad signal, and it's not going to make any difference. The editor is not going to act after a short amount of time. But of course, if it takes too long, you should contact the editor. You should not feel humbled by these mythological figures called the editors, because papers do fall through the cracks. It's sad, but it's just true. When you deal with this with large number of submissions, a few will always fall through the cracks. And sometimes, actually, you may find it's happened that you have not submitted your paper. So you thought you submitted, but you forgot. So you uploaded everything, you completed all, you filled out all the fields, and all of a sudden you realized you didn't hit the submit button. So after a long while, not bad to contact. How long is too long? 3 to 4 months is a good rule of thumb. You feel pressed for time, even 2 months are okay, but not earlier than that. And don't try putting pressure on the editor by saying, my tenure decision depends on my paper being accepted, because it is, most editors would say, it's not my job to ensure you get tenure. My job is to check that your paper is good enough to be published. So my suggestion here is the golden rule of the stock of 5 papers, which means that as soon as you're out of your PhD, try to build a stock of 5 papers that gets replenished every time one of them gets published, so that you always have something you're working on and you always have 5 papers out submitted somewhere. Just because it's a fact of life that things take a very long time, at least in economics. And my experience with philosophy and political science is not enormously different. Okay, you've written your paper, you've gotten it out, received feedback, you've looked at all possible journals around, and then you've submitted the paper. You've waited, maybe you've prodded the editor to get information, and eventually you do get the news. Again, may seem trivial to you, but read the decision message and the referee reports carefully. And by carefully, this is extremely difficult. All authors think that there is inevitably a bias, that whoever read their paper, unless they suggested to accept it, massively misread it and didn't understand its content, blah, 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 its content, and so on and so forth. But it is very important to read the message and the referee reports, even if the referees are biased. And if something's not clear, feel free to contact the editors. A polite message saying, sorry, I did not understand this and that is not bad, especially if, as this slide says, you get a revise and resubmit verdict. So it is of fundamental importance that when you're given the opportunity to revise and resubmit, you read carefully, you understand exactly what they want, and before you do anything, make sure that the message, the overall strategy is clear. Always provide a detailed reply to the referees and the editor explaining what you've done and also what you have not done. I've seen a lot of authors shooting themselves in the foot by simply not writing a reply and saying, or writing a 1-sentence reply saying, I've done all they asked, or everything that was reasonable that they asked. And that sends a very, very bad signal, because very often the referees come back and say, okay, where's the reply? Do your best to incorporate all suggestions, each and every one of them. If you disagree with some comments, clearly indicate in the letter why you disagree and how you dealt with the disagreement in the paper. Because the point of incorporating suggestions is not to do whatever you're asked, but to show that you've done your best to respond to the suggestions, which might imply, sticking to your guns, and that's totally fine. But it must be motivated as opposed to giving the impression of having ignored the referee's comments. The editors cannot simply say, okay, this guy has completely ignored referee 2, well, that's okay. Because if you've asked advice from a referee, normally you want to make sure, provided the advice is reasonable, that it's been taken into account. And never, ever be confrontational. Again, this is what a bunch of heterodox editors tell you. If the editor gives you an answer, don't argue with him or her. Yes, the review process is not the best, and often mistakes are made. Editors have to rely on reviewers who have more expertise in the subfield of the paper than the editors. If you believe a serious factual error, I would add, was made by the reviewer, it can be worth pointing this out to the editor. But before doing so, it would be worth consulting others to see whether they agree with you. And if you do raise the issue with the editor, do so in a polite way. Don't be aggressive and don't threaten to never send another paper again, because any editor would say, fine, good. So if there is a factual mistake, just make sure that this is very, very clear. I've seen it's happened, not to us, not to the Review of Social Economy, but I've seen situations in which, for example, the wrong set of referee reports have been sent to an author, or other factual mistakes, a referee claiming A when the author was saying not A. And these things are okay. But starting off by saying this report is worthless and this guy clearly has not read my paper is basically shooting yourself in the foot almost automatically. Take time to revise the paper. but do not take too long. I've seen people missing deadlines and then forgetting, and then having their paper considered to be a new submission. So if you need more time, just contact the editors. That's totally okay. Provide a motivation and ask for a specific amount of time or a specific extension to the deadline. Another thing which is often forgotten is this. If the reports point in opposite direction, say with one saying you should cut out section 4 and another one saying, oh, section 4 is the most important part of the paper, expand it, or if they contain factual mistakes that make the revision difficult, like somebody saying, okay, this theorem cannot hold or can hold only under special assumptions, then feel free to contact the editors, because it is their responsibility to provide guidance in these cases. And they cannot simply say, do what the referees asked. If it is a minimally professional journal, they have to take a stance. So shall I cut section 4 or shall I expand it? Let me know. I cannot do both. If a journal editor says, oh, I can't tell you, you have to do what they asked, that's not a serious journal. Or at the very least, explain what you've done and the difficulties you've faced in the cover letter at the revision stage. And believe it or not, one thing that is a major no-no is revisions ex post facto, i.e. you get a paper accepted and all of a sudden you change things. I've even seen one paper which was close to being accepted where the authors asked to change the authors, say by adding new people or removing others. This is a major, major no-no. What happens if your paper is rejected? Just move on. There's no point protesting. There's just no point. Unless there is a major factual mistake, the decision is irreversible. There is a major incentive for each journal editor not to concede the point. So they will never, ever admit. It's extremely rare that a rejection is overturned. So keep this in mind. And the other point is, keep in mind that the refereeing process is not a voting mechanism. So your paper may be rejected even if both referees recommend acceptance, and rarely vice versa. Why? Because it is the editor and not the referees who makes the decisions. So I've had a paper rejected even if two referees recommend to accept. The referee's task is to give advice to the editor and not to the author. So the referees make a suggestion and the editor decides. It's very useful to take into account the referee's comments very often, even when they're suggesting the rejection, if you send the paper elsewhere. First, reports are generally serious, thoughtful, and insightful. Once you've cooled down and you look at your paper with the necessary distance, you realize this. Authors who complain about referees usually focus on inessential details rather than the main substance of the review. Yes, the reviewers didn't understand your point, perhaps, but it was your responsibility in the first place to get the message across. So by and large, reviewers understand papers well enough to evaluate them. When they don't, it is usually because the author failed to communicate very well. Moreover, referees offer good advice about how to improve the paper and take the research to the next level. Another reason not to be, a more practical and less kind of intellectual reason to move on, is that you may easily encounter the same referees. They are likely experts in your field. And if you protest and maybe your protest is forwarded onto the referees by the editor, or if you just ignore it and send the paper elsewhere, showing that you have ignored the serious issues pointed out previously, that is very important information about the quality of scholarship. And it may easily be the case that the paper gets sent to the same referees and then the paper is shot down. I have once submitted a paper, and after 3 rejections, it was eventually sent in a different journal. where it was accepted. But one thing that struck me was that 2 of the 3 referees of the latter journal were actually people who had seen the paper previously and had had a positive review. The interesting thing is, the reason I know it is because they had submitted exactly the same messages with even the heading of the previous journals. So review written for blah, 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 different journal. Final friendly suggestion. If you're sent an article to review, just accept the invitation and then do a good job and do it by the deadline given to you. Of course, this won't guarantee a future paper of yours will be accepted, but you always want to be on the good side of the editor. Refereeing well is actually one way to do this. And in many cases, this is how people are nominated to editorial boards. Sometimes journals send papers to referee to authors currently under review. So you've sent an article to your journal X, and the editor of journal X sends you in return another article to referee. If you decline the invitation, that you send a very, very bad signal. Actually, some journals offer you, those who have submission fees, in some cases allow you to waive the submission fee if you promise to referee for them. So anyone can become an editor by becoming a super referee. Referees who respond quickly with thoughtful reports are appointed as associate editors after half a dozen years or so, and from there soon become co-editors. And lastly, if you want to put things in perspective, there is this pretty nice paper, How Are the Mighty Fallen? Rejected Classic Articles by Leading Economists. And I wish I could find something similar in other disciplines. And time to stop to share. Sorry, I went on for longer than I thought. I'll mute myself. Okay, I'll look at the...
There are already 2 questions in the chat. Maybe we can start with these, and then people can use the raise hand function and Roberto can respond directly.
Okay, so a question for the referee suggestion. Should it be a person you might know even in another department, or it should be someone you have any link with, but just established in the literature? It could be either. So the big no-nos, I mean, some editors don't even care, okay? Some editors would send. So I think that it should be people who have a clear standing in the literature and who are credible referees. If it is a colleague of yours in your department, is normally bad. If it is a co-author, it's a borderline situation. So I've been sent papers written by my co-authors, and what I normally do is I write to the editor and say, I'm willing to do it, but you should be aware that this guy is a co-author of mine. And sometimes the editors say, I know that, but I'm still willing to hear from you. So I don't know whether this is an answer, but again, if you think of, say if you suggest 4 names, I think that you give enough choice to the editor, and I presume there will not be 4 friends of yours. Incidentally, in small fields, it will be inevitable. It's just impossible not to mention somebody you worked with or it's a friend of yours. So if you work in a tiny subfield where there are, say, 10 people in the world, it's just a matter of fact that you won't be able to name an unknown person. Can you confirm that multiple submission is what happens when you submit a paper almost identical to one you have already published in a different journal? Actually, the more subtle case, so that's self-plagiarism. The multiple submission case is something that has to do with you sitting on the desk and then submitting the same paper first to one journal and right after that to a different journal. It is very tempting to do it because, you know, if it takes years and years to get a response from one journal, you may want to, you know, spread your net wide. But keep in mind that every single journal I know asks you to tick a box that says, this is not under review anywhere else. Book publishers don't have this. So if you have a book manuscript, they are very, very open, and therefore it depends. There are rules, but it's much less frowned upon than in journals. In journals, it's just a major offense. Will it be possible to receive the slides afterwards? I think they'll be posted on the ASE website. I enjoy seeing some art with museums closed. With pleasure. How can you become a referee? You just have to wait to be called upon. There is no particular reason. Oh, Andrea Chu, can you hear me now? So somebody says,
I could hear you all the time. I don't know about
okay.
others, but I see some people nodding, so it's probably on
Okay.
Andrea's side. Yeah.
Yeah. Any more questions? Are referees really that anonymous? Oh, anonymity is... Okay. So Kate, do you mind specifying what you mean? So the refereeing process goes from triple blind to double blind to single blind to open. So open, a good example of an open, completely open refereeing process is the review of radical political economics, where everybody knows who everybody else is. 1. 2, single blind is where the authors don't know the referees' names. Double blind is where this happens for both, and that's the norm. Well, single blind, double blind are the norm in economics. Triple blind, the only example I can think of is ethics in philosophy, where not even the editor knows the identity of the submitter. Now, are referees really that anonymous? So let me offer you, so if the question is about referee anonymity as opposed to author's anonymity, let me read one of my favorite anecdotes. And let me read it to you. This is again from McAfee, who says, I overheard an author tell another economist at a conference what an idiotic referee he had for an AER submission. He went into some detail about all the stupid things the referee said, and the economist listening to the story commiserated and wholeheartedly agreed with the author. You have probably already figured out that the commiserator was the referee in question. This referee had actually written a very thoughtful and serious report on a paper of a friend. As is sadly common, the author didn't appreciate the insight available in the report. So if you write in a very small field, it may sometimes be the case that you can guess who the referee was. But it's normally very difficult and there is significant ambiguity. The other way around is less obvious, since many people nowadays publish, this is especially true in economics, much less so in political science, sociology, and philosophy. But in economics, a lot of people publish working papers, which is one of the reasons why many journals have stopped adopting the double blind or triple blind procedure, because it takes a second to identify the identity of an author. So I guess I did not really answer Kate. Let's say that the process is anonymous as it can be. And with referees, it's okay, generally. With authors, hardly ever. Are total numbers of articles published per journal very fixed? No. Journals have a page budget. So the publisher tells you you have, say, 400 pages, for example, per year. It does not vary according to how many good papers they select to publish normally. And one of the reasons it doesn't happen is because very quickly journals, or good journals at least, attract a high number of very good quality submissions and build a pipeline of papers, a backlog. So no, it's hardly ever the case that you don't exhaust your page budget, Elisa. Christine, what are some of the reasons why the editor will reject a paper if both referees recommend a revision or acceptance of the paper? This is a very good question, Christine. So first of all, it depends on how enthusiastic the referees are. So if the referees say, yeah, this is a reasonably good contribution to this field, but they're not blah, they're not glowing about it, the associate editor, especially if the associate editor is somebody who works in the field, may say, well, I'm just unconvinced. Of course, this raises the issue of why did you send it to 2 referees in the first place? But it does happen. I've seen it. It's happened to me at least twice. Sometimes, so if you are a journal receiving 600 submissions a year, and there are many such journals, then you don't read each and every submission very carefully. You skim through them, desk reject a few, others seem okay, and you send them out, but you don't look at them very carefully. And then when the referee reports come in and they suggest accept, at that point you read them carefully. So this can happen. It's not brilliant, but it happens. Acceptance, well, it's happened. Again, I've heard of people where the referees suggested to reject and the editor took a stance and said, no, I think this is an important paper. It could easily be because the editor is somebody who works in the field and thinks, well, I think this is a major contribution, and the reasons that the referee is using, the reason that is adducing, are not very convincing. And that's totally normal. That's nothing particularly wrong. Again, keep in mind that the quality of referee reports varies enormously. You said if you have enough time, aim high. Wouldn't that make a bad reputation? Look, I handle about 200, as a first port of call these days at Rose, I see 200 submissions a year, between 200 and 300 submissions a year. I don't remember names. I would never remember anybody who sent a paper which is below bar and then next time think, this is a guy who sent a bad paper. Besides, most people, I mean, we all have our good papers and bad papers. So the fact that you send a not very good paper and was rejected, it's a matter of life. It happens all the time. It doesn't prevent you from sending another paper to the same journal. If everybody who's been rejected by, say, I don't know, the American Economic Review stopped sending there, probably half the profession would never publish there, even if they wanted to. What is a good goal in terms of publishing for a PhD student? For example, should I aim to publish 1 article by the end of the PhD? Elisa, this depends enormously. It's very difficult to say. So these things vary with time and place. So I don't know how it works in Sweden, but for example, in the UK, where there is this research assessment exercise which goes under the name of Research Excellence Framework, departments are extremely nervous to hire fresh out PhDs without a forthcoming article. Why? Especially close to the deadline where they are evaluated, they don't want to take a risk that they get somebody who then doesn't contribute to the ref. And this is compounded by the fact that the tenure process is not really anything close to the tenure process in the US. So if you were to apply in the UK, I would tell you, yes, do it. In the US, for example, it's very different. So having a very strong job market paper that holds promise is very often sufficient to get a job. So it doesn't really matter. And besides, should it be 1 article in a very good journal, or should it be 2 articles in 2 middle ranking journals? Again, these trade-offs vary enormously from country to country. Okay, Elisa, follow up to my question above. Is the final selection of papers to be published then prioritized by first come, first serve, or those which are the most insightful? Very interesting question. This is, so basically what happens is you have a backlog of papers and then you are asked so the publisher contacts you and says, okay, what is the running order for the next issue? And I guess it depends on journals, but normally there are several trade-offs. So on the one hand, you want to do a bit of first come, first serve, because keep in mind that there are papers that we are about to publish now that were submitted first in 2018. Why? Not because we are nasty or inefficient, but just because they went through, say, 2 rounds of refereeing. In each round, the author took 6 months, another 4 months for the refereeing process, blah, blah, blah. So what's the point of postponing further a paper that's been sent 3 years ago? We hardly do it on most insightful basis, and I think most journals do the same. What may happen is sometimes you collect papers that are on similar topics. So rather than the most insightful ones, you may think, okay, look, by chance, we've accepted 5 papers on, say, intersectionality. So that was a chance. Why don't we put them all together? Because that makes them much more visible, which is the same principle of special issues, by the way. Suppose you develop a topic across 2 papers, for example, one detailing the theory, the second detailing empirical methodology or providing a case study. Is it a good idea to submit both papers to the same journal to ensure both are published? Very few. Again, you may be lucky. So one of the most famous papers in philosophy, correct me if I'm wrong, Lisa, is Dworkin's paper on equality of opportunity. And these were 2 very large papers published in Philosophy and Public Affairs. But he was Dworkin, even at the time. He was a very big shot. If I send a paper, 2 papers, 2 companion papers to a journal, I don't stand a chance, or it's a very, very low chance. Again, because you have to keep in mind that space is limited. So they will ask, should we publish 2 papers from this person? So, or should we give more space to somebody else? So have more voices heard. So if I were you, I'd seriously consider differentiating, especially if you have such a neat distinction between, say, theory and a case study or theory and an empirical methodological paper, then there seems to be an obvious incentive to send the 2 papers to 2 different journals specializing. Would the cover letter, so Chemseddin says, if I pronounce it right, would the cover letter also be sent to the referees in which they can show your explanation and arguments? No, normally referees, so if there is, suppose you say something like, okay, and by the way, I should warn you that this paper has, I don't know, another companion paper, which I cannot mention for reasons of blah, 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 but it should be taken into account in the refereeing process. That's additional information which may be important to relay to the referees. But if you're simply saying, okay, this is what the paper does, so you are kind of restating the abstract, or you're trying to clarify what the paper does, that's a bad signal, because the paper should in principle be self-contained. So apart from any information which for whatever reason cannot be in the paper, I would, the cover letter is hardly ever forwarded to the referees. Sometimes the online material, which is just for the refereeing process, can be forwarded to the referees, but you should clarify that it should be the case. That's the kind of stuff that goes into the cover letter. Is it realistic for undergraduates and master's students to publish papers? Do they have a chance of being recognized? Yeshwant, the paper I mentioned right at the beginning, the one I submitted, I was a master's student. So I was treated as such, and but in a good sense. Again, the philosopher who looked at it clearly, I mean, even wrote, this is clearly a PhD student, but took the time to help me rewrite the paper, which was eventually, after very many years, published. So it is, I don't see why to discourage you. In fact, I think it's a very healthy process to submit your papers, even as an undergraduate or even as a master's student. It gets you accustomed to the process. But note that the process I've discussed and outlined is a long process. So very careful writing, plenty of discussions at conferences with your colleagues, etc., which makes it unlikely that by the end of your master, you will have a paper that fits all this discussion. By the way, let me offer you another wonderful report, because you say, Yeshwant, so do they have a chance for being recognized? So again, Preston McAfee. As a final anecdote, I received a report from a respected economist who said in the letter to me, quote, I have written a gentle report because the author is obviously inexperienced and very junior, and I don't want to discourage him. But make no mistake, this paper makes no contribution and you should not encourage a revision, unquote. The author of the paper, which I rejected, had already won a Nobel Prize in economics. So Chemsedine, I meant that the cover letter contained more details for referees and not only for editors. Chemsedine, I'm not sure what kind of details for referees would be relevant that are not contained in the paper, except for stuff like, by the way, there is an online addendum, make sure that this is sent. Oh, the cover letter, sorry, for the revise and resubmit. My apologies, Chemsedine. Yes, okay. This is a very good point. Thank you very much. So I should have explained this. So one thing is the cover. So when you get a revise and resubmit, you do two things. You can write a reply to the referees, and then you can write a cover letter only meant for the editors. So when there was something factually wrong in the referee's report, or there was a clear sign of bias, I mean, but something obvious, it was not just that you didn't explain yourself, but the referee got something badly wrong. One thing you can do is you write a reply to the referee where you very politely explain that, you know, while very relevant, the point made by the referee could be taken in a slightly different way, and perhaps it's not so important in the revision. And at the same time, you can write a cover letter to the editor saying, by the way, I just couldn't incorporate this comment because it was based on a factual misreading. So the referee says that I am claiming my theorem to hold under assumption X, but I don't state assumption X, and it's actually proven in the paper that it doesn't depend on that. So that kind of stuff, it's absolutely fine, and you can clearly differentiate what you sent to the referees and what you sent to the authors. Elisa says, seeing that it takes so long to publish, should we aim to write relatively timeless papers? Oh, this is, Elisa, what can I tell you? So I write papers on stuff that most economists consider to be dead. So one of the nicest, in many respects, reports I ever received was concluded by the following sentence. And by the way, this topic should be confined to the dustbin of history. So I'm probably not the right person to ask, but I think you should write what you think is relevant. Of course, a perfect counterexample is the COVID thing. So if you write, in fact, I faced this issue myself. I'm guilty of writing yet another COVID paper. We are inundated by that. And I swore to myself I would never do it, but I did. Now, you write a COVID paper. There are journals which take a year easily to send you a report. In that case, you send a COVID paper, say, about how vaccination should be done, and you send it now, and it's full with details of how it should be done now, as opposed to something general about how vaccination should take place during a pandemic, you're committing suicide. But if you are writing, in that case, you either find one of these outlets that publish stuff very quickly, or you just give up that and you try to phrase it in a more general way. Lisa.
Just to jump in here, depends on what it is, of course, but it has become somewhat more acceptable for academics to also publish blog posts or op-eds or other kinds of publications. So if it's something where you have a quick idea on something that's happening right now and you don't do a lot of background research, then you might also consider writing it as a blog post and finding a good outlet for that. So that's a decision that you need to take early on, because if you invest the time for an academic paper, then of course you want to publish it as an academic paper. But if it's something that is really very timely, take this option into account. Maybe, a quick, good blog post, maybe a bit polemic, whatever, is a better option. And then you keep working on the other stuff you've been working on for your academic papers.
Yeah, I completely agree. But if you mean timeless as in, well, I'm thinking about working on, say, Keynes or, I don't know, Ricardo, Marx, and these are dead dogs, then I don't think that's really relevant. It will be difficult to publish this stuff, of course, but it's still, there are still outlets welcoming these papers, including the Review of Social Economy, by the way, but not only that. Hong says, can I send a paper if I'm not working in a university? Absolutely, yes, that's not a problem. Do people affiliated with the university have priority over people working in the private sector? Absolutely not. The only thing I would strongly suggest is to mind my earlier comments, i.e., make sure it is pretty obvious that you know the literature inside and out. So many editors would kind of hesitate. So if I remember correctly, Spence, who eventually got the Nobel Prize in economics, had trouble publishing the paper that he eventually got. He's one of the most famous rejections, I think, in history of the discipline. And he eventually went to work in the private sector. And I think he still worked on papers from the private sector at the time. But you really have to make sure that you keep up with the literature and that it shows in the paper, so that the editor or the referee cannot exercise their conscious or unconscious bias and say, well, this guy doesn't know this and that. The kind of biases that are at work here, Sihong, are not very different from those that are sometimes exercised towards people who write papers outside the discipline. So you are an economist and you send a paper to a philosophy journal or vice versa, and you can always find somebody from the other discipline saying, the philosopher saying, oh, this guy is claiming that he has formalized John Stuart Mill, but he has not read, the entire collected works, and there is this letter written in an obscure whatever that blah, blah, blah. Or the economist says the philosopher, oh, come on, this guy is making all these grand claims. There is no proof. Something similar is at work with people, outside the university, because people can simply think this guy just doesn't know the papers that have been written on this topic. So I would pay extra attention to that if I were you. Okay.
Do we have more questions? It's Friday evening in many countries, so maybe not. Well,
just
in that
feel
case,
free to ask anything. Now, let's give them one last opportunity. Just ask anything, ask away. I mean, we're here.
Yeah, well, let's give it another 2 minutes or so. And you can also raise your hand and unmute yourself if you want to.
Yeah, if I could just say something to get some people interested in one of the later presentations, which Lisa and I will be doing along with another colleague. Incidentally, the next presentation is going to be by Paolo Ramazzotti, who's the editor of Forum for Social Economics. He's here, but I wanted to make a little comment about the discussion today and how it relates to the discussion in the third meeting, I'm sorry. Many of Roberto's comments looked at different disciplines, and it said things about what about, the main contributions to your discipline? You should speak the language of your discipline or the jargon or whatever. Now, Review of Social Economy is an interdisciplinary journal. And in fact, I, for example, personally, and maybe some of the other, maybe all the co-editors think that discipline is nonsense, okay? Very often. It is made for, to serve certain powerful interests in a particular profession and not about a discipline, or it is meant to serve the interests of powerful people who want to say, make economics self-contained, saying it should be free of political and social influences. So in any case, we're trying to develop an interdisciplinary journal that goes beyond the boundaries. And questions can arise, how do you do that? And that's difficult to do in a world where you need to get a job as young scholars, but you also want to be taking into account factors that you think are important in ways that do not belong to one discipline. What do you do then? So that's what at least I will talk about, and perhaps Lisa and I forget who else. And I think this is not only relevant because Rose, Review of Social Economy, our journal is intentionally an interdisciplinary one with two economists, one more micro, one more macro, although I belong to a political science department, belong mean I work in, and Lisa is a political philosopher, and Paramita is a sociologist. So that tells you that we don't like to be thought of as an economics journal. In fact, our title is Social Economy, not Social Economics. So we are not sort of an adjective social to economics. So, but it's also that we firmly believe that interdisciplinary things should be promoted and make a lot of sense. Anyway, so.
There are a couple more questions, if I may go. So is the timeline for special issues different from regular issues? Completely, in all possible respects, Kalpana. So normally the special issues have guest editors or editors who are devoted mostly to those. There will be deadlines, say for submission. Sometimes there is a workshop associated with a special issue. So a call for papers comes out, a workshop is organized or a conference, then it's not always the case, but sometimes it is. So it is a much more complex process. So call for papers, workshop, conference, discussion of the papers, and then final submission, for example. And the timeline, even for actual publication and production, is slightly different because these papers have to be put together. So yeah, that's why I mentioned be on the lookout for these things. Chloe, suppose I have no online addendum or other info to provide regarding the paper. What should I say in my cover letter when submitting the paper? You may even say nothing. That was my point. I mean, some journals require you to write a cover letter. We don't, for example. Other papers actually explicitly discourage you from writing a cover letter, precisely because the idea is that, you know, whatever you have to say is already in the paper. Kavitha says, you had mentioned that there is no straightforward way to become a referee. What can I do as a young scholar to improve my chances to be called upon to referee? The honest answer, I have no idea. I don't even remember how I was called upon to referee the first time. Normally, I would say that, again, you go to conferences, you get somebody to know you, and then they send you a paper. I mean, the whole point, so the initial path in the discipline, unless you come from the super top departments where, you know, rules are completely different because you're in the right networks, you have to create your network. And the best way to create your network is to go to conferences, to meet people, to show your work, to display your work. showcase it, and then people will eventually contact you. I don't think that there are any databases for referees or people who volunteer to referee. I have a couple of times received letters from people saying, I'm willing to act as a referee. But the truth is, you forget these things as an editor. I mean, you get millions of emails all the time, and you don't keep track of this. The online submission systems have a function that allows editors to do a search for referees, but it's very, very random. It's one of these things. It's a bit like Google Translate of old, which just was funny and crazy in many respects. So I've hardly ever used it. Gustavo, what is an appropriate number of papers to have published in publishing process and in writing? I was motivated by this golden rule you mentioned in the presentation. Could you expand? Okay, I call it the golden rule, but so my idea, I mean, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. So one of the first papers I ever published was written as a chapter of my dissertation. It was first written in 98, submitted in 2001 to a journal, which eventually accepted it and published it in 2007. Okay, now if this is the time, and this was in economics, a paper published shortly thereafter sent to a political science journal in 2008, eventually published in 2013. Now, if this is the timeline we're thinking about, in economics at least, then what you want to do is to have a stock of papers. You don't wait, you don't put all your eggs in a single basket and have one super strong paper that just takes forever to get published. Try to build up a stock. I say 5, just because 5 is a nice number, and 3 seems small. But if you have a stock, one paper gets rejected, eventually another one gets published, and you replenish it. So you should have 5 papers always at some point in the publishing process. That would be my suggestion. But I'm very risk averse. Other people may be okay with 3 or fewer.
Roberto, if I could interrupt and add something about the previous question about how does one become a referee. I think this is one of the very unfair issues in academia, that very often the people who are selected as referees are known personally to the editors, and sometimes they even use their own students, graduate students. So you can see how this creates a bias in the whole thing, right? That, professors push their students, they become referees and they get some power. So I don't want to get into, now you're already at a place, right? So one shouldn't choose everything in terms of, I want to go to a so-called top institution and so forth. But the other way to get in is to submit papers to journals where you're reasonably confident the paper is decent, good, okay? So even if you're rejected, you might still be considered as somebody who could referee other papers, because as Roberto mentioned, it's very hard to find referees, especially people who are really very active, because they don't want to do that. So they are always looking for referees, and sometimes people find referees from suggestions from the, the system itself. And many of those are rubbish because they just pick up keywords. So editors are looking for good referees. So if you can either get to know some of the editors and can make a positive impression, especially by submitting to that journal, I think that is the way to go.
I'm going to mention another thing in a second, but Kavitha, you said, when writing with other co-authors, how does one go about discussing and determining individual author contributions? This is a very interesting question. Very, very interesting question. And it opens a can of worms. So it's a very complicated one with huge disciplinary differences in practice. So, I mean, so why do I say a can of worms? Because this has to do with, for example, roles and roles of power. So you write with your PhD supervisor, or you write under the supervision of this person, and this person then decides that their name should be there and perhaps as first author. Yuck. It happens and it's sad, but it's very difficult for journals to avoid this. This is sadly something that has to do with how the whole academic process is biased against younger people, and very often minorities in all respects, ethnic, gender, blah, blah, blah. So my reaction would be that you should fight your, stand your ground if you can. The truth of the matter is that it's extremely difficult. So at Rose, at the review, we have been considering the possibility of adopting contribution statements, I think they're called. So in the sciences, in the natural sciences, they have this thing where the authors of each paper have to provide a statement clarifying who has done what. So it's an empirical paper with a literature review, the methodology being explained, and then the actual empirical analysis. And there's 3 co-authors. The big guy has done the literature review and maybe a bit of, style polishing. And then the 2 younger people have done one the methodological part and the other one the empirical part. So ideally, there is a statement, an official statement signed by all authors saying this is what each of us has done. It's extremely difficult. So although this, one may argue, can protect younger scholars, it just pushes the unpleasant power relation to an earlier stage. So we're still in the middle of discussing this to see whether this can be done and whether it actually makes a difference. Related to this, so the order of co-authors is another thing. Now, this varies a lot from country to country. So in some countries, single-authored papers count much more than co-authored papers, and being a first author or not makes a difference. In other countries, this is completely irrelevant. So for example, in the UK, for research assessment purposes, it's irrelevant whether the paper is single-authored or co-authored, and it's completely irrelevant whether you're the first named or the second named in the list. In other countries, as I said, this is crucially important. So I strongly prefer alphabetical order, which means normally that I'm the last in the list. But for example, we have adopted at the review one thing that has been introduced by the American Economic Association, one of the few things that they're doing good or doing well, I think, and that is authors who submit to Rose can use the author randomization tool of the American Economic Association, which I encourage you to take a look at. So basically, if you co-author a paper with other 2 people, you can put your name, you just go on the website, put your names in this tool, and it returns the names of the authors in random order. And then you just, so for Rose, for example, you just need to insert a footnote saying the names have been randomized. So the author is irrelevant. I think this is a nice way of protecting younger authors, for example, from bossy supervisors. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is this. Now, so diversity and inclusion is a very, very important and delicate thing. You may have seen that a lot of journals are finally taking some action about this. If you're worried, my suggestion is not to look at what they state on the web pages. My suggestion, so if you come from a minority or if you think that it may be a massive bias, my strong, wholehearted suggestion is don't look at what they state on their websites, because they will all pay lip service to these things. My suggestion is to look at, one, what they publish, and even more importantly, their editorial board. And that will give you a pretty good idea about how open they are, how diverse they are, and that, you know, whether certain things matter or not for them, whether inclusion, for example, is a value. So we have four editors. We have, I think, so we have 2 men, 2 women, 2 white, 2 people of color, although I'm not sure how to count myself. But this is very, very important. If you're worried, I think that what people do is much more important than what they say. And it's much more truthful revelation. So again, take time to look at the outlet you're thinking about submitting your work to, and that will give you a pretty good idea. I'm glad you liked the choice of art, Jan.
Probably now getting towards the end. Last chance if people still have questions. If not, maybe you can now unmute yourself and we can give a round of applause to Roberto, which is not just virtual applause, but maybe those of you who can do this, we can actually really do this.
Could I just suggest something before doing that? Since I made a sort of a little preview of our talk, we allow Paolo to do the same if he wants.
Paolo, would you like to do this? This is a bit mean because we haven't asked you before, but...
Hi, Paolo.
There he is.
Hello to everybody. Thank you. I got confused because of the summertime switch, and so I got here late. I apologize for that. I really don't have much to say. I think that I will have. I think what Roberto just said about the editorial team in our case is important. In our case, we have people from different parts of the world: China, Russia, Ghana. Unfortunately, we just lost a co-editor who died last week, and that is a great sorrow. She was from Latin America, and then I'm from Italy, and that somehow was our effort to be open-minded about different cultures, different approaches to economics. Amitabha mentioned some things about interdisciplinarity. I think they are very important. To some extent, they apply to the forum, although the forum has a different approach, and I will be talking about that during the second meeting, so I will not waste your time talking about it right now. I think that's about it. Thank you.
Okay, so applause for Roberto now, yeah.
I'm blushing. You cannot see it just because of the light.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and hopefully see you again for Paolo's webinar, and then the one that Amitabha and myself and Sarah Stefano will do on interdisciplinarity. And good luck with your academic work. Stay safe. All the best. And have a nice weekend.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.